This week's episode of the Neoliberal Podcast was originally a Patreon-exclusive episode released only to our supporters on Patreon, but now it's coming to you for free to a wide audience. If you'd like to get access to every episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, including our exclusive bonus episodes for our supporters, please go to patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining us today is Ed Gresser. He's the Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at PPI, and we're here to talk about the international system of trade and how it's been upended entirely in the last 3 weeks. You know, we've seen potentially more turmoil and more major sanctions than we've seen in a decade, almost in the last 3 weeks. You know, it's been an intense amount of really harsh sanctions all at once. The global economy is changing right in front of our eyes. And that's the topic of today's episodes. What sanctions have been levied against Russia for their invasion of Ukraine? What are these sanctions going to do to their economy? And what are they going to do to the economies of Europe and America and the rest of the world? And what does this mean for America's domestic picture in terms of inflation and supply chain issues? So, Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Very glad to have you. And frankly, it's been a whirlwind 3 weeks for anybody who's involved in international markets or international trade or anything relating to that. I guess my first question is, as someone who follows trade a lot and has seen a lot of sanctions and a lot of discussions about this kind of thing in the past, has it surprised you how fast this has moved?
I guess I would say I'm not surprised by how fast it has moved, but I am surprised by how much of the world has joined in this. U.S. in a crisis, the president has a lot of emergency powers. There's International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and if he thinks the circumstances are dire enough, he can cut off trade, he can cut off financial flows, he can do quite a lot of things. What was striking is not so much the speed of the U.S. action, but the degree to which other countries joined into it. U.S. typically is relatively speaking is a kind of enthusiastic user of sanctions. We sanction countries a lot. It is rare, and it's been a long time since we've sanctioned such a big country in a way like this. But it is extremely unusual to see the European Union joining in this. It's unusual to see Japan joining this. It's unusual to see Australia, and New Zealand, and Korea, and Taiwan, and other top-tier world economies all doing this at the same time. The only things I can compare it to are a couple of UN Security Council sanctions on Iraq, sanctions on North Korea. So there's a few isolated and extreme cases of smaller countries and countries that aren't really major players in the world economy being sanctioned. There hasn't been a case like this for a very large country in a long, long time.
Yeah, it's funny. I recorded a podcast at the beginning of this whole thing, just a day or two after it happened. And at that point, I was hoping there would be really harsh sanctions from a lot of countries, but I wasn't sure that it would really happen. And I used the phrase, like, we should make Russia into North Korea, and then caveated by saying, I know we're not going to be able to do that. There's not going to be enough will. But it seems like there has been. So
we've come. It's not quite all the way to North Korea, but it's not that far away.
We're like 60% of a North Korea.
Yeah. I guess I could first review what actually has happened. Most of the world's major financial powers have cut off Russian bank access to financial flows. Most of the world's major manufacturers of top-end technologies have barred exports of sophisticated software, semiconductors, lasers, IT security products, and other things to Russia. A large chunk of the world's big importers have revoked Russia's most favored nation tariff status. Some of them, including the United States, have cut Russia out of the energy export market. Most of the world's airports have barred Russian planes and airlines from landing. At least 3 of the world's big shipping companies have announced a kind of embargo on accessing Russian ports. Same has happened for a lot of Russia's train access to Europe. So this is a very significant set of sanctions spread across quite a lot of different issues. It is similar to North Korea in that China is not joined in. So that North Korea's outlet to the world is a few miles of border with China. Russia has more outlets to the world. It has China. I do not believe Turkey has joined in sanctions. So that means Russian shipping has some outlets to the world. The Russian land cargo has some outlets to the world. I think that's also true of the Caucasus and Iran. So it's not all the way at the North Korea, not all the way to the North Korea model, but it's something that is really astonishing to see happen to a big country.
The size of Russia does make a difference here, because normally when you sanction a small country, it hurts them more because they don't have the ability to do it all themselves, right? North Korea certainly can't manufacture most of the things that they want to have, and so sanctions hurt them a lot. Whereas sanctions, if we were to impose sanctions on China at some point in the future, China has a kind of a parallel economy where they can manufacture a lot of their own things. They can they have their own tech sector, their own IT sector, their own advanced manufacturing for a lot of things. Where does Russia fall on that spectrum of if one end is a tiny country that has no advanced manufacturing and has to get everything from somewhere else, and if the other end is the United States or China, where they have almost every industry and they can be independent if they need to, where does Russia fall?
Russia is probably in the long term closer to the U.S. and China than it is to North Korea. But at the moment, it's probably more near the North Korean end, in that the way the Russian economy has evolved is over the past 15 or 20 years is under the pressure of a massive case of Dutch disease. The economy has really become centered around exporting natural gas and oil and metals.
And can you clarify for those who aren't familiar, what do you mean by Dutch disease?
Dutch disease is a economic phenomenon, often referred to in development literature. That countries that find themselves possessed of enormous amounts of natural resource endowments often stay poor, often become very, very centralized in terms of economy and political power. They find their currency rising so high that it's hard to develop manufacturing and it's hard to sustain an export agricultural economy. And that is what's happened, one of the things that's happened to Russia, and one of the things that has made Russia the Russian government so powerful vis-a-vis Russian society, and allowed Mr. Putin, his family members, senior government people to own very large yachts, to own their own planes, to have extraordinary amounts of personal wealth, while Russian public outside this circle remains kind of poor, and also has allowed the Russian government to finance itself more or less without taxing anyone, just by skimming off oil money. And so they've been able to build up quite a large military that way. So that has left the Russian government with a lot of financial assets. It's left the Russian army large and possessed of lots of tanks and trucks and planes and so forth, but has left the Russian economy outside that nothing at all like the Chinese economy. They don't have a big manufacturing establishment outside of defense industry. They don't have a very successful agricultural economy in large contrast to Ukraine. And so it will be difficult for Russia, especially in the short term, to manage the economy without a lot of stress and a lot of suffering during this bout of sanctions. You can expect Russian aircraft, even internally, will have to be grounded after a while. Russian defense industry is going to run out of semiconductors and parts. Russian energy economy is going to have the same sorts of problems. Russia is obviously a country with a lot of money, and it is hard to imagine that, at least for a while, it won't be able to keep earning money by selling energy. So it will be able to spend for itself to some extent, but it is hard. It's a lot harder for Russia to weather this than it would be for China.
I've read interesting analyses of Russia's economy, and one of the things that strikes me is how much it's changed since the Soviet Union. Because, geopolitically, it wasn't that long ago, 30 plus years, that they were the Soviet Union, and they were behind the Iron Curtain. They had to make everything for themselves. And so, maybe their versions of things were inferior to ours, their tractors and their cars and their et cetera, but they could make them. They had an industry for almost everything.
Mm-hmm. They still have a couple of auto plants.
Yeah,
so,
and now it's like they were self-sufficient if in a lower poorer quality, but now 30 years later, it's like they've transformed. The phrase I've read is they're a gas station with a nuclear arsenal, essentially. And it's very interesting to me. To me, it seems like the kind of thing that happens when you live in an autocratic system that's more focused on what can I loot out of the economy rather than what can I build and grow in the economy.
I guess I would take the point. I have a somewhat different emphasis. When people are saying Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons, I think that's overstating it a bit. Russia has always had a quite strong educational system. They have a lot of scientific talent. They have managed throughout this period to hold on to a kind of globally influential defense industry. So I think that is probably overstating the case. The other thing I would say is that Russia is an economy that's exceptionally well suited to looting in a way that you go back to the China case. The China economy is not all that well suited to looting. China has hundreds of thousands of enterprises, lots and lots of small specialized manufacturers that are run by people with ties to the party, but also who are trained and they're entrepreneurs themselves. And whereas Russia really is dominated by 4 or 5 gigantic state enterprises, Gazprom and Lukoil and Rosneft and other energy companies and some mining firms. And those are companies that take in most of Russia's export earnings. They are staffed essentially by state officials. And so the government and the few people who are near the top of it have control over most of the country's earnings in a way that is much less true of China. To draw an analogy, it once looked at trade among Muslim world countries. And this was maybe 10 years ago, so the statistics aren't valid anymore, but I think fundamentally it's correct. The 2 largest Muslim world exporters are Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, and both of them had about $250 billion in exports. Malaysia, this figure came from about 5,000 manufacturers and tech companies and food exporters, which employed about probably 2.5 million people out of 20 million in the country. Saudi Arabia, it was the vast majority of their 250 billion came from one company, Saudi Aramco, which employed 50,000 people. And Russia is much more like the Saudi case, and China is kind of more like the Malaysia case. So, countries big as China, there's a lot to skim off, but it's hard to skim off most of the national wealth of China, which you can kind of do in Russia.
So let's talk about what's going to happen to Russia's economy and what's already happened. And honestly, I think that anecdotes are useful here to kind of give a picture, to give an impression of what's happening. Obviously, statistics and models are more scientific, but there's anecdotes that I've heard. You talked about how planes are probably going to start being grounded because they can't get replacement parts. Even within a few weeks, they just won't be able to run their planes, even internally. I heard a story that was, I think this just came out today, that Russian banks, some of them have stopped granting credit cards. And you might say, because of the whatcha blah, 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 the credit reasons. Apparently not. Apparently the reason is that they literally don't have any plastic to make credit cards anymore.
That's really interesting. I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, so I imagine there's all these kinds of stories. Are there any other particular sectors that you can think of where just some of these rules about imports and the ban on financial transactions are going to lead to this kind of anecdote that is really illustrative? I'm wondering if you have any more examples.
One I just read this morning is that Russia has a one national auto producer, Avtovaz, and it has, as of yesterday, shut down its production. They say for 20 days, but probably indefinitely because of lack of parts and equipment. So I think you're going to see things like that cropping up all over the place.
I still don't think their stock market has opened, has it? It's been closed. Every day they announce that it's going to be closed for one more day, it feels like, and it just hasn't been open for 3 weeks.
Stock market continues to be closed. It's hard to see why it would be reopened.
It's one of those, it almost feels like a peekaboo situation with a child. Like, if I don't reopen it, nothing bad can happen.
I'm still here. It appears likely that Russia today will go into default on sovereign debt. That's happened in Russia before in 1998 during the financial crisis, and that led to a decline in Russia's GDP of about 12%.
Can you think of another instance of a country as big as Russia defaulting on their debt, in between Russia in the 90s and Russia today? It seems like a really big deal. Russia's a huge country, right?
Yeah, Russia did it in 1918 as well, after the Bolshevik Revolution.
But has China or India or any major Western European economy that's very large, are there any other big countries doing this, or is it basically just Russia?
I'd have to go back in time. It's been a very long time since any major European economy went bankrupt in this way. It's happened in Argentina a number of times. So there are, I think, Brazil at one point. So there are cases of large emerging economy types of economies that have defaulted. But I know for a fact that in the United States, in 200 years, there's never been a default. The only case where we ever came close was when we still relied on cutting physical checks. And one morning, I think in the early 1970s, the Treasury's printing press broke down, and they were a few minutes late in getting finding an emergency press and delivering the check. But for large, powerful economy, and an economy that, as of 4 weeks ago, had $600 billion stowed away as financial reserves, this is quite unusual.
That's a fascinating story about the printer in the 70s. I've not heard that before.
Yeah, I came across it. This was a few years ago when Republicans in Congress were threatening to cause a default, not raising the U.S. Debt limit. So I was looking back, has there ever been a case where the U.S. did go into default? And the answer was no, but there was this weird technical glitch that it cost us, as I remember, I think I'm right about it, it cost us about $50 billion in extra interest payments over the next few years.
So we know that Russia is going to have a lot of issues over the next months and years, depending on how long these sanctions last. I've seen forecasts anywhere from 5% of their GDP this year will be lost to 15%. It could potentially even be more. I feel like we're we're all kind of in uncharted territory in terms of anticipating how bad this is going to be for the everyday Russian. But
yes, it's hard to predict, and some of it depends on to what extent can Russia continue to sell energy, and what will this do to energy prices. But the typical Russian will see, I think, a difficult couple of years ahead for sure.
And just, there's a lot of people whose jobs will be disrupted because they can't get parts from Europe or the United States. Even the places where Russia does manufacture, the couple of industries they do have, they rely on parts from the West to a large extent. Yeah. And they're not going to have products. McDonald's has pulled out, and IKEA has stopped selling, and those things seem like, oh, they'll have to go without IKEA. That sounds like a punchline, but like, if you add up enough of those, that becomes a real point of pain for an everyday person.
Yes, I think I've seen film clips and video clips of very, very large crowds in the last days of their IKEA store closing, Victoria's Secret, so on and so forth. You can say, well, these are flashy brands, but there are also furniture and underwear. People need those things, and Russia doesn't have a lot of local production of those things. At some point, they're a large country. They can create substitutes, but I don't think it can happen within days or weeks. And you don't have the distribution networks that are going to be efficient. So this will cause a lot of stress on people's lives. I would wonder also about food distribution. That was something the Soviet Union was never really able to do very well. Russia now has much larger cities, so they're going to have to find ways to get processed food and keep it in the stores.
One of the things that's been really fascinating is that I believe just in the last couple of days, Putin has signed an order paving the way for some sort of nationalization of businesses that have left the country. If McDonald's is leaving the country, if IKEA is leaving the country, if Levi's Jeans is leaving the country, then the government may nationalize those and say, okay, well, we're going to run the McDonald's stores now. And in the short run, I suppose that's better than having them sit empty. But in the long run, you've got to question, is any business ever going to invest in Russia ever again if Russia goes and nationalizes a ton of like giant multinational companies?
You'd have to ask them. I think there will obviously be a reaction to this. Russia is, it's a large country. It's an important market in principle. As long as the Putin group remains in power, it's hard to see Russia getting out from under these sanctions, and it's hard to see businesses able or interested in going back. Once the day comes that it does begin to open again, I think you're quite right. If you're a international airline and you've had your airplanes stolen from you, and then you'd have to have some very strong reason to want to go back there. And you'd have to have a lot of faith that whatever government succeeds this one is either going to make you whole, or at minimum give you a very strong guarantee that you'll be safe there.
Yep, it's hard to beat the market. You can cheat the market in the short run, whether that's not paying your debt or seizing a company. But in the long run, the consequences of that are going to be pretty severe in terms of increased cost of borrowing in the future, or, reduced investment in your country in the future. And
yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the seizures are also essentially to no purpose. Like, if Volkswagen leaves, obviously they'll leave an auto plant behind. If Google leaves, they may just leave an empty office, and if you spare old computers behind that are hard drives wiped and basically worthless.
Yep,
IKEA probably leave an empty building.
I guess you can sell whatever stock they have left, but that's they're not going to ship you more clothing, or more furniture. And we should note that, look, I believe these sanctions are a good thing. I'm glad they're as harsh as they are, but we should note that this is going to hit the everyday Russian people very, very hard. People who may not want this or have anything to do with this. And it is very unfortunate that, that when these sanctions happen, regular people pay the price, and it doesn't necessarily make the sanctions wrong, but, it's something we should stop and acknowledge since it's the whole topic of the conversation.
Yes, I fully agree with you. I spent a lot of time learning Russian. I was a graduate student, had a lot of Russian friends. You don't like to see anyone suffer, but this is a really serious question of the way the world will be in the next generation. To me, it's the war with Ukraine. I was looking back a few weeks ago, listening to a speech that the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations gave to the Security Council several days after Russia had attacked. And he referred to the UN Charter, which was signed in 1945, and referred to the principle that countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. And so, went back and read that part of the charter, and thinking about it, that is something that countries tried to do. It's a principle that countries tried to establish after the Second World War, that not again would large, powerful countries attack their neighbors and try to wipe them off the map. And as ugly as the history of these last 75 years have been, and as much as governments have often disappointed people, that actually has been something that's been very widely respected. That going back, I think the only other case of one country trying to attack and annex a neighbor is under Saddam Hussein, the government of Iraq tried to annex Kuwait in 1990.
I was going to say the first Gulf War. Yeah, there's been many wars, of course, but
there've been many wars.
But the straight up, I want to absorb your territory. This is mine now. There's not very many.
No, they're not. And the only other case you could make is, I think, in 1975, the North Vietnamese government absorbed the South Vietnamese one. But I would sort of read that more as a long-running civil war than something like what's happening now. And in the case of Iraq attacking Kuwait, that was obviously something the world rightly stood against, and I'd put Iraq under similar sanctions for decades. But it was a relatively small and isolated rogue country with a rogue dictator attacking its neighbor. The Russian action is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's a country that has a high level of responsibility to make sure people respect these rules, and is the culprit in this case. So the Russian attack on Ukraine is not the attack of a small and relatively isolated dictator on a neighboring country. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of the 5 countries that's supposed to show especially high respect for these principles and make sure that others do so as well. And if it succeeds, then I would think the taboo of these last 3 generations against wars of conquest will be much weaker in the future than it has been throughout my life. And likewise, if this attack fails, then that taboo will be greatly strengthened, that even a country as powerful as Russia will not be allowed to do something like this. So this is obviously a terrible humanitarian tragedy, with many, many Ukrainians dying and suffering and in hospitals and losing family members. It is also, as you say, a real blow to many millions of Russians who have no control over what their government does. But it is a kind of hinge point for the 21st century future. And one outcome, I think, leads to a much more dangerous and unstable world than we've had in a long time. And so I think it's important that the United States and others do as much as we can to make sure that it does not succeed.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to fully agree with you there. I think about this in terms of game theory. It's basically what you said here. Even if we are not going to dissuade Putin in this instance, which maybe the sanctions are going to work, maybe they're not. I think the speed of the sanctions and the scope of how severe they have been and how hopefully severe they will continue to be is going to win the next war for us, or prevent the next war, I should say. You have to fight this war, and you have to fight it both militarily and economically to stop the next version. There's a game theory way where, you could give in to the bully, but it just means that people are going to be far more incentivized to be geopolitical bullies.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well put. I think I've read a lot of people sort of looking back at these last 10 years and saying the penalties Russia received for taking over Crimea, for taking bits of Georgia, they were relatively small, and probably may well have emboldened Putin say, whenever I take a step forward, others take a step back. So maybe that's the way the world works.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what's going on in the West, though, because in addition to impacting Russia, which is the most obvious thing, some people are very worried about what this is going to do to the West. So I guess there's two real questions here. What's going to happen in Europe and what's going to happen in the United States? So how do you think about the way the sanctions will impact those economies, the European economy and the American economy?
I would say, most directly, it won't be that troublesome for us. And it will be more troublesome for Europe than for the United States, but not overwhelmingly so. Russia's place in the world economy overall is quite small. Russia has about 1.5% of world imports. It has about 1.5 to 2% of world exports. It has about 0.5% of currency flows. It's a very large country, but it isn't really a core part of the world's manufacturing supply chain or of financial and currency markets or of agricultural trade. So in that sense, we lose a $6 billion export market. That's out of about $2 trillion in U.S. exports. Not damaging. For Europe, Russia is a much larger trading partner, and Russia is a very large supplier of energy. So Europe really does have a challenge over the next coming months of finding ways to extricate itself from reliance on Russia for natural gas and for oil. And so their adjustment is much harder than ours. We'll notice it because the world energy market will be more volatile, probably. So people are always too quick to complain about gas prices. They'll probably have more to complain about, but it's not something that is going to shake the foundations of the American economy, nor put cracks in the walls of the American economy. We can adjust fairly easily. There are probably a couple of things that are a little bit challenging. Russia is a large supplier of some specialty metals, like palladium and rhodium and titanium, and those are used in advanced manufacturing in various ways, in sophisticated automotive parts and in dental and medical devices and so forth. So there will be some industries where important inputs are suddenly scarce, and we have to do more recycling, we have to find new sources and those sorts of things. But for the United States, this will be a matter of relatively modest adjustments in a few specific industries, not of something that really makes us vulnerable to energy crisis or really shakes U.S. production in any particular way. What is going to happen is that always when there's a war or a major sanctions event, countries watch and learn. So U.S. has been unchallenged in global finance and currency markets in part because our financial markets, Treasury Department, Federal Reserve policies have been seen as very stable, not politicized, designed, to the extent fallible people can design policies for efficiency and success for economic growth. We're cashing in some of that right now by saying, in some circumstances, we're going to lower the financial boom on countries that really transgress, and other countries that feel at some point they might be at risk of this will be watching. They'll be looking at Russia to what sort of counteractions did Russia take, what worked, what did not work, what do we need to reduce our vulnerability to these sorts of measures that we now see the U.S. can and will use in extreme circumstances. So that's a long-term price that I think we will be paying.
I want to switch gears for a second because we've been talking a lot about sanctions, and it's the main topic of this episode. But there is one other thing that's happening in kind of global markets and the global trade network that I find very fascinating right now and potentially worrying. And it's the Chinese situation with COVID. What's going on right now, as best I understand it, is that Omicron is beginning to break through in China because Omicron is simply very, very contagious. It's almost impossible to stop. China is still pursuing a zero COVID policy officially, and so you have some incredibly large cities going into lockdown. I believe Shenzhen, which is a major manufacturing area, is in total lockdown for at least a week. Shanghai, which, 20, 25 million people maybe, is in partial lockdown. And there's even other provinces, I'm not going to list them all, but there's other provinces, big and small, that are doing, either complete lockdowns or partial lockdowns. And just frankly, it seems like this is going to continue. Either China's going to abandon zero COVID as a policy, or they're going to have to keep locking down cities for months on end, potentially. And I wonder, how does this impact China, and how does it impact America? Is it going to make inflation worse? Is it going to make our supply chain issues worse? What's the deal here?
That's a great question. It's yet to be seen in a way. As a couple of points of departure, Shanghai has the world's largest container port. It handles about 43 million containers each year. Shenzhen, a couple thousand miles away, just north of Hong Kong, it has the world's fourth largest container port at 23 million per year, or 26 million. Our largest container port is Los Angeles at about 9 or 10 million a year. So these are gigantic centers of exports and manufacturing production. Shenzhen, as you say, is closed for a while. One of the side effects of that is that Foxconn, Apple's big contractor for making iPhones and iPads and whatnot, is closed for the time being. There are dozens of small parts and semiconductor fabs around Shenzhen that are also closed. The port is still open, as is the Shanghai port. They've had, as I've read, a policy of requiring port workers just to live at the port and not go home. So they're a little bit isolated from the public, and so I think China is trying very hard not to allow those outlets to the world to close. But what has happened, including in Shanghai, is that closures mean very, very large backups of trucks coming into ports or for shipment outward, and that has pretty drastically affected the logistics chains. Like I don't know how representative this is, but one of the Washington Post columnists, Rampell, tweeted a chart, I think it was done by Flexport, looking at the time it takes to move a shipment of goods from a Chinese factory to a buyer in the United States, and said that it's now about 104 days on average, and before COVID it was about 50 days. 104 days is about as long as it took clipper ships to get from China to the United States in the 19th century. So this is a big, big change in the world's logistical networks for quite some time, as long as these closures are coming on and going off. And it happens in other suppliers as well. It happens in Vietnam and other big import sources. We're going to have longer waits. We're going to have less reliable timetables for delivery to the United States. So that makes it harder for us to solve all the supply chain problems we've seen outside our own ports. Probably a long-term effect is that buyers, retailers, and importers and so forth in the United States will be trying to do more from Latin America and Central America and Mexico than they were before, and trying to reduce a little bit their reliance, especially on China, but maybe on Asia more generally. I think that it will have some positive effects. I think the Biden administration is definitely convinced that the U.S. supply chain is probably too vulnerable to single source suppliers and isn't diverse enough. It probably also means the trend we've had over the last 30 years of consumer goods always becoming cheaper and better each year, that will probably slow down. So if you like the things you've got, that's good, because it's less likely that each year that you'll have something cheaper and better to replace them with.
Well, so this is an interesting question for me, because the Biden administration has taken this line that make it in America is going to help inflation. But to me, a classic economics argument seems like, if you have to make it domestically, it's going to cost more in a rich country like the United States. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that idea, that make it in America is how we kick inflation in the butt?
I don't quite understand that idea. I mean, companies, I think, can be criticized for relying too much on the cheapest possible sources and not thinking ahead and diversifying enough. But if it were cheaper to make somewhere other than they're making it now, they would probably do it, unless the cost of moving is so high as to make it prohibitive. So if it were cheaper to make things in the United States than it now is relying on imported parts, then why are they not already doing it? I haven't really figured out the logic of this. So I agree with you.
I think it might be political logic and not economic logic.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine, times and technologies change, and the more you have 3D printing, the more you make very sophisticated and complex machines without human labor, then maybe cost in the U.S. relative to other countries is steadily going down and be more and more attractive. But I think there, at least in some areas that they've identified, in semiconductors and in medical equipment and probably electric vehicle components, it may be important to have U.S. and allied capacity, but that's not the same as an inflation argument.
We've got time for just a couple more questions. I want to ask about the scary scenario. I've heard people start to whisper the R word, recession. And the job market and the economy have been very, very hot for the last few years coming out of COVID. We had that huge dip in COVID. But since we've started coming out of that dip, job gains have been very fast. The unemployment rate is very low now. The economy has grown at a very quick rate. And so most people think that in general, the job market and the economy has done pretty well. But at this point, people look and they see there's potentially a big oil shock about to happen. And, of the last 7 major recessions, 6 of them were precipitated by oil shocks.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
Well, and we don't know whether it causes them, but I think it's something like that. It's like 6 out of the last 7, there was a oil price shock beforehand. Whether it caused it or not, we can debate. But, you have a supply shock like oil, which just hurts the economy. There's no way to get around it. You have a supply shock potentially coming up from China, where supply chain is already really bad and it might get worse. And that's essentially another supply shock. And then you have inflation running really high, and the Federal Reserve has signaled that they're going to do a bunch of rate hikes this year, and that could slow down growth. And so with rate hikes plus oil shock, some people are starting to whisper, we might be in for a recession. Other people don't take it as seriously because the economy has been so strong over the last year. Do you have any opinion on this about how concerned we should be?
Well, on the supply shock side, we will presumably have a pretty significant interruption of Russian energy sales to the world. U.S. right now is essentially self-sufficient in energy. We have a kind of small deficit in crude products and a small surplus in refined stuff. So U.S. is a lot more insulated against that sort of thing than we were when I was a kid, when we really did have a series of energy crises and stagflation and so forth. We are probably more reliant on imported parts and components for U.S. industry and for the tech industries and financial services and entertainment and so forth. So, a real China supply interruption, I think, would be pretty difficult to manage for a while. As you say, the Federal Reserve is kind of committed to raising interest rates, and I think is correct to do so. But I think the economy is right now very strong. It hasn't gotten to such a peak of inflation that you need a Volcker shock type of response to it. So I'm not predicting a recession myself. I think growth will probably slow. The labor market is, as you say, it's very hot. We've been adding tons and tons and tons of jobs, but we're still, I believe, a little bit below pre-COVID employment. So a lot of the heat of the labor market is people coming back to work, and not. I don't think so far labor markets are shooting so far beyond capacity that's overheated. It's something to watch, but I think I'm sort of on the interested and not sure what to expect from all of these events, but relatively optimistic that we have a soft landing option.
All right, well, we're coming up on time, so I will ask our traditional final question. For people who are interested to learn more, who want to follow news about the sanctions or news about international trade, what would you recommend that they look into or read?
Well, I think from our trade project, we've published a few things that I think are interesting. One is last week, U.S. decided to remove most favored nation tariff status from Russia, and many other countries joined as well. We have a very good explainer on what that actually means. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control is the place to look at state of sanctions. I would also recommend the Commerce Secretary and Commerce Department Secretary Raimondo, who are responsible for the export control piece of this. Outside, Peterson Institute for International Economics has a very kind of well-designed one-page timetable of sanctions impositions by date and by country that explains here's what all the various countries and actors have done to date. So I think those are places I would start. I guess I should also plug we have easy to read, fun, and I think quite informative weekly feature called Trade Fact of the Week, and provided for free to anyone who's interested in signing up. So please do.
Yes, Trade Fact of the Week is very good. We'll include a link where you can sign up to receive Trade Fact of the Week in your email.
And follow neoliberals on Twitter. Lots and lots of high-powered economists and economic journalists and various smart people, always using it to share ideas and data points and things you might not have heard of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I hope that for peace, and I hope that we don't have to use these sanctions for very long, but I'm glad that we're prepared to if we need to. My guest today has been Ed Gresser. Ed, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks. Grateful to be here.